This lecture is on moral theory as it relates to pornography and the wider issue of censorship. There is no corresponding chapter to this issue in your textbook, so there will not be a reading quiz 11. Instead, at the end of the semester, I'll give everyone a free 100 on a reading quiz 11.
Okay, first of all, your author on this chapter was actually inadequate on his definition of pornography. He only provided you with the narrow definition of pornography, so we need to first look at the broad definition. And please take some notes on this, because remember, when you have your next exam, it covers the lectures and not the readings, and so you will be responsible for this. So we take a look at the word pornography. It is a Greek compound word, graphos meaning a depiction of something, and pornos meaning what is considered wicked or evil. So a depiction of that which is wicked or evil. And the broad definition does not simply relate to nudity or sexual material in literature or media, but it is any depiction in literature or media that encourages a person to act on his or her most base desires. Many of you probably followed the news several years ago when there were many parents very upset about video games such as Grand Theft Auto. And there are many parents still upset about the violence and sometimes the depiction of women in video games today, and feel that this encourages primarily young boys to develop a very negative attitude toward girls and women. And so in this case, there are those who are proposing that a particular video game is pornographic, not because it may display a particular sex act, but because it is inviting, in this case, again, young boys or young men to act on their most base desires. Now, some of you may be very curious to wonder why I have one of the very tragic pictures of 9/11 in the bottom right here. Let me explain here, because this is something that's common in our media today, and we just saw this recently, most recently, with the tsunamis in Japan. Initially, these sort of pictures and this kind of media is not considered pornographic, because the first time these things are viewed, it is informative, and whether the news is good news or tragic news, we are learning information about something that is going on in the world. What oftentimes happens with extremely tragic stories like 9/11 or the tsunamis in Japan is that the audience will continue to obsess and just watch these depictions over and over and over again. And it's at this point that ethicists and philosophers will make the argument that when we become so inundated with all of this media that we have in news programs today, that it almost becomes this obsession with being an onlooker of a tragedy and just taking in over and over again. And this can cause us to act on our most base desires, and a tragedy can, for some people, become a form of entertainment as they just continue again to obsess over those depictions. Okay, so realize we do have this very broad definition of pornography that your author failed to introduce you to, and it is anything, any depiction at all in literature or media that invites a man or woman, a boy or a girl, to act on his or her most base desires. Okay, now let's get to where your author did a fine job on the more narrow definition of pornography. He was right to differentiate between two kinds of pornography. Softcore pornography, that many people would say is not pornography at all, but instead should be referred to as erotica. And this is literature or media that depicts a mutually satisfying sexual experience and has a commitment to respect toward all persons involved. Okay, so this means that all persons involved in this particular sex act that is being photographed or being videotaped, that everyone involved, this is a mutually satisfying, respectful relationship that's happening. Now, as we move on, by the way, there's disagreement here. Some people would not insist that there is no such thing as erotica that is respectful in this way. I think the symbol you have on the bottom left here is where the big debate would be. Some people will say something that is softcore pornography, like Playboy, is harmless and is erotica and can be used by couples to increase the sexual satisfaction of their relationship. The more conservative approach would be to say that even Playboy, softcore pornography, or erotica is inherently disrespectful toward women, that this is not a respectful display of sexuality, and therefore it is morally impermissible. So hear both sides of that there. There is certainly a debate over whether there is moral legitimacy to something like Playboy. And then, of course, at the top right here, you have pictured the triple X, and that's considered your primary symbol for hardcore pornography. And this is literature or media that depicts one person having sexual control or manipulation over another person. And whether this is a feigned control, an acting job that let's say usually perhaps the woman involved in the video is a paid actress and has decided to pretend that this relationship is one that is violent or something's going on that she doesn't want to have happen. That doesn't matter whether it's feigned or real. It's still hardcore pornography because the picture that the viewer is getting is showing a weaker figure being debased in that pornographic display. Okay, and when we come to the issue of censorship in pornography, we're talking about the term obscenity. Determining the obscenity of literature or media is an extremely subjective endeavor. You're never going to get every single member of a community to draw the line in the same place of saying what is obscene and what is not obscene. Broadly speaking, however, something is considered obscene if it engenders moral offense within the community. Now, I think you can then understand why not everyone in a community is going to agree on what is obscene. It's, again, a very subjective concept here. And most philosophical ethicists agree that determining obscenity has some areas that are black and white. And so when it comes to pornography, there is an extremely hardcore depiction of pornography called a snuff film, in which it's usually always a woman is depicted as being raped and her life is even taken at the end of the scene. Now again, whether that is feigned, an acting job, or whether that's really happening is not the determining factor here. The fact is the depiction being shown is violence is being done against a woman as part of that sex act. So almost all moral ethicists would make the argument that a snuff film is most certainly obscene, no question about it. But then, when you get past these sort of black and white issues that almost everyone could be in agreement, most ethicists say that there is certainly a gray area between these two poles of certainty. I mean, what if you have a pornographic film that shows some rough sex taking place? There are some people that would say that is misogynistic, very much putting the woman in a role of victim, and there are other people that would make the argument that some individuals voluntarily enjoy rough sex, and so therefore that is not obscene. So again, you can really see that the gray area would come in there depending on some people's personal preferences. Again, really subjective endeavor when it comes to determining obscenity. Okay, what about guidelines for censorship? Don't you love the picture of this button off to the right here? The worst part of censorship is, and of course it's been censored, so we don't know. Most ethicists, and especially utilitarians, are committed to avoiding both legal moralism and legal paternalism. Legal moralism is when we have a particular majority within the community and they have decided what they think is moral and immoral, and they try to impose that upon the minority. John Stuart Mill, probably the most famous utilitarian that we've looked at this semester, calls this, and your author points this out, it's a great quote, calls this the tyranny of the majority, that the majority of people would try to control what the minority have access to. And most utilitarians are also against legal paternalism, and this is when the government, when the legislation tries to act as the parent over the rest of us in society. And again, it was the best example was the one I think your author used here of the seatbelt law, that the government, state governments will have a law that you have to wear your seatbelt, and that is simply to protect you. But it's not because harm would come to someone else here, and then that's usually what we look at when we have a moral some sort of moral legislation take place, is you're making a law to protect one person from harming other people. But the seatbelt law is not doing that. It is protecting only that individual. And so therefore, it's legal paternalism, government legislation attempting to play the role of parent. Usually censorship is decided by whether or not the literature or media being considered will cause harm to the wider community. So I just made a reference to that. If it's just an individual's preference and it's only affecting that individual's life, then we're usually going to see censorship denied. But if it can be proven to a legislative body that a particular action or exposure to literature or media is going to cause harm to others in the community, then censorship will be considered and sometimes enforced. And so when we come to our issue for this week, pornography, this is the big question. Is it inherently misogynistic? If that's a new word for you, it's also a Greek compound word, miseo, meaning hate, gyno or gune, meaning woman, so a woman hater. So is pornography inherently hateful toward women and certain to bring harm to innocent women in the community? I suggest that your answer to this question will probably determine your ethic about the censorship of pornography. Okay, and lastly, some moral theories concerning the censorship of pornography. Pictured top right here, you see the term porn with the negation sign placed over it, the prohibition sign placed over it, so that would be a symbol for the censorship of pornography. And an excellent movie done several years ago, Woody Harrelson starred as the founding editor and owner of the pornographic magazine Hustler, and got himself in a bit of trouble with some powerful people, most especially a fundamentalist religious leader, Jerry Falwell. And so we have this case against Larry Flynt. Can he do and say the things in his magazine that he is doing if it's causing harm toward others? It was determined by the Supreme Court that Larry Flynt had the right to do what he was doing in his magazine Hustler. It is a good movie, maybe a bit too graphic for some of you, but if you can handle that, I would put it on your list of movies to watch because it is very well done. Okay, non-consequentialist. Okay, so we're looking at our Kantians here. Those who emphasize rights of self-determination and individual freedom will tend toward non-censorship of pornography. Whereas those Kantians or non-consequentialists who perceive pornography as inherently degrading toward women will argue for censorship. Again, you can see here with Kantians, they're not looking at the consequences, they're just looking at the goodness or the rightness of the actual substance of pornography. And those who feel that the higher moral regard should be toward individuals having freedom to do what they want to do and see what they want to see as long as it doesn't cause harm to others, well, they will say that, well, what we have here is just this right of self-determination, and that should be allowed. Again, those who perceive just, again, here with the word inherently, you're not looking at consequences, just the inherent value of the thing in and of itself. And so the thing here is pornography, and it is viewed as inherently degrading toward women, and so therefore a Kantian would argue for censorship. Of course, we change up what is most important to us when we come to utilitarian approaches. And utilitarians will study the consequences pornography has on its proposed victims in the community. If the proposed victims, usually women, are indeed shown to be victimized by pornography, utilitarians will move towards censorship. Okay, it's been proven by the study. The utilitarian will say that this is causing harm to women, therefore it needs to be censored. However, if utilitarians have studies that show that the victimization is a fallacy, that it's really not taking place, then those utilitarians will move toward non-censorship. And this is a difficult issue. As you saw from your reading, there are some studies that show that harm does come to women because of pornography, but then there was a study done less than 10 years ago by a collection of ethicists within Europe, within Western Europe, that showed not only did it not cause harm toward women, but it in fact gave women greater safety and security within the community. So it's a difficult task when you're a utilitarian and you have these studies that oppose one another.